I'm sure the question that everyone wants to ask, because everyone asks me, is, how did you come to write the book? What provoked the great thing? And that's a paraphrase from John Galbraith's introduction to his book about the Depression. He said, the question he's overwhelmingly asked is, how did the great thing come about? And I feel impelled tonight to answer that question. And I suppose the most obvious answer why I wrote a book called The Devil's Delusion, Atheism and Its Scientific Pretensions, is vanity. Everybody who writes for the same underlying motive. But beyond vanity, what, I'm telling you something you don't know? Would I be standing here without? Not a prayer. But beyond vanity, there's the second of the important imperatives in my life, at least, and that was irritation. There I was, sitting in Paris, comfortably ensconced in my apartment, without a care in the world, and I started reading these books: Christopher Hitchens, Richard Dawkins, Daniel Dennett, Paralytic Bore, Sam Harris, and even Steven Weinberg, who waddled into the discussion to offer his opinions. And I said to myself, this stuff is just preposterous. It couldn't be so. And then I read some more and I realized that it was so. These people were seriously affirming a position that no one who's read 10 good books could possibly entertain with any degree of seriousness. So I said, aha, this is made for measure, like a good suit. It has to be that I respond to it. And so I wrote the book. What essentially is the source, the gravamen of my discontent with the new atheism? Well, it falls into a number of different parts. If you look at these books about atheism, it's not simply a repetition of the old, well-established arguments offered by the village atheist. You know, the sort of guy who in the 19th century would be laboring over a plow, muttering about 2 Corinthians and disputing with his neighbor the existence of God. It's not like that at all. The theme that connects all these books and that makes the new atheists a movement unto themselves is the conviction that God does not exist because science tells us so. Now, as for myself, I don't know whether God exists. Monday, Wednesday, and Friday I go one way, Tuesday, Thursday, and Saturday another way, and Sunday I devote to a day of rest. So my views are inconclusive, and you should take nothing I say or nothing I have written as evidence or argument one way or another on the perennial questions of mankind. That's not my intention. But on the other hand, the idea that science has demonstrated something of fundamental human importance about the existence of God is very much my concern, because I think it's a false idea. And I think there are no good arguments supporting it, and I think it's important to say so and recognize that it is so. Now, why am I so persuaded? Well, in the first place, I very much doubt that there is anything answering to the name of science, any more than there's something interesting answering to the name of democracy or justice or peace. These are concepts, they're immensely important human concepts, don't get me wrong, but they're concepts exhausted by their examples. If we want to know what a democratic society is, the best we can really do is point to a democratic society. And by parity of reasoning, if we want to know what science is, in anything other than an institutional sense, the best thing we can do is to look at a scientific theory. And of these, there are only finitely many. And of the great ones, there are only 4. And if we want to know that science has shown that God does not exist or has shed any light on the religious questions of mankind, we have to consider the great scientific theories: Newtonian mechanics, Maxwell's theory of the electromagnetic field, Einstein's theory of relativity, and quantum mechanics. And we have to stop there because there are no other great mountain-like theories in the sciences. That's not to say that that exhausts the sciences, but if we want to go further, we point to examples. There's molecular biology, an interesting discipline. There's ceramic engineering, an interesting discipline. There's quantum chemistry, again, an interesting discipline. But we can do no better than list things, and if we're interested in the most important aspects of science, we can do no better than pointing to the great, the monumental theories. And the extraordinarily interesting thing is, if we say, look at quantum mechanics, look at the premises that are invoked in quantum mechanics, or its conclusions, one thing is striking by its absence, and that is any reference to a religious issue. You won't find it there. The same thing is true of Newtonian mechanics. It's the same thing is true of Clerk-Maxwell's theory. The same thing is true of relativity. They simply do not address the questions that perplex and torment the human race. They're like a cow in the kitchen. As Dr. Johnson once observed, it's a very good animal in the pasture, you don't bring it into the kitchen. Similarly, quantum mechanics is a very good animal in the field, you don't bring it beside your bed. It doesn't belong there. So that was one issue. That was one issue. I thought that it is late in the day for anyone, especially those who are committed to an intellectual way of life, like us. It's very late in the day to be taking the name of science in vain, because too much is at stake, not only in terms of discussion of religion, but in every human context. For far too long, we have been assaulted with the view that science has a voice all its own. Well, let me impart a secret to you. It doesn't. It doesn't have a coherent body of theoretical principles that are uniform throughout the sciences, and it doesn't have a method beyond any method that we would use in any particular human pursuit, golf, for example. If you try carefully to demarcate or delimit the scientific method, what you get is a series of trivialities. Be careful, cut the cards, look at the evidence, do an experiment if you can, and for heaven's sakes, don't trust anything on anybody else's word, and if your experiment fails, the last but most important principle, blame someone else. Those are superb principles, I endorse them, but they do not characterize science as a separate discipline. So if science has no organizing body of principles, either in its assumptions or its conclusions, and it has no distinctive method, to my way of thinking, it follows, right, that it cannot speak with a single voice. It just can't speak with a single voice. Consequently, when I hear a physicist saying, like Vic Stenger, look, science has shown that God does not exist, my natural reaction of irritability is augmented and immeasurably improved by my conviction that the guy is a lunatic. A conviction I've held to the present day. In the second place, it seems to me that far more than we would like to acknowledge, far more, scientific attempts to answer very deep and significant questions are no better and no worse than comparable attempts within the religious tradition, which after all is of long standing. Take the most obvious sorts of questions that are perplexing not only to an undergraduate, but to all of us. We look around, we're in touch with the universe, we see the thing, and if we reflect, if we allow our imagination to wander just a little bit, we certainly in the end arrive at the question, why is that thing there? I mean, it includes us, but why? What is the nature of the universe in terms of its origins? What is the nature of the universe in terms of its purpose? What meaning does that whole immense, glorious structure really have? Now, this is, of course, a question that the religious tradition of mankind has addressed again and again and again. I don't have to remind you what that tradition says. Can we turn to the sciences in order to better understand the origins of the universe? Well, to a certain extent, the answer is yes, because from the perspective, say, of cosmology, the study of the heavens and their origins, it really does seem as if the universe is finite in temporal extent, that is going back, we reach something like a beginning. This was a remarkable discovery of the 20th century. Don't forget, Einstein rejected this conclusion. He found it abhorrent. A universe that began with something lacking in aesthetic symmetry. And until the 1930s, he rejected the idea that the universe could have had a beginning. Nonetheless, the overwhelming weight of observational evidence would seem to suggest that, yes, the universe did have a beginning that we commonly refer to as the Big Bang. Lots of difficulties with the theory. Let's set aside the difficulties and just take my word that this is more or less the consensus of cosmologists. The universe is finite in its temporal extent, reservations included. The idea of a beginning Does it suggest anything? Is there a flicker of memory that might be prompted by the idea that the universe began? Well, it depends where you're looking, right? If you're looking in Richard Dawkins, the answer is, I don't remember a thing. If you're looking in Sam Harris, the answer will be, I don't really get the question because I've never studied the sciences. If you're looking at Vic Stenger, the answer is, he's a physicist. No, you're completely wrong. We can explain the origins of the universe. It only looked as if it began. That's a mistake, a mistaken thought. You've got to adjust your eyesight so you can properly appreciate the glory of my analysis of the beginning of the universe. And what is his analysis of the beginning of the universe? Well, let's suppose there was another universe before our own. And that universe tunneled into the one we inhabit. Do you see? Are you satisfied? Has any derangement of the soul been eased by that declaration? There's no need to rush the podium with an answer. I know what you're thinking. You're thinking, Dave, this couldn't be what this crackpot said. But it is. And he's not alone. If you look at Stephen Hawking's A Brief History of Time, a book that was eagerly sought and never comprehended, you will find a very similar doctrine, disguised in an elaborate amount of mathematical mumbo-jumbo. And I'm the last person on earth to object to mathematical mumbo-jumbo. It's my stock and trade. But I recognize a co-conspirator. I recognize the spirit. What does someone like Stephen Hawking say? Well, your problem, Dave, is that you think that going back in time means backing up. It does, but only to a certain point. At a certain point, going back into the past, sort of just before the Big Bang, prompts certain embarrassing questions. We're going to change the mathematical structure so this feeling of going back disappears. Can we do it? You bet. We're mathematicians. Does it make any sense? No. So, your point being, it makes no sense at all. This is a second attempt in contemporary cosmology to answer some of the deepest questions that the human intellect can pose. And as you can see from my warm remarks, I hold both efforts in about equal measure of contempt, and I think you should too. And I developed this point in the book, and it's not simply for the chance to abuse people like Vic Stenger or Stephen Hawking, although I welcome that chance. Obviously I do. Nothing gives me more satisfaction than kicking and lashing out. It's a congenital weakness on my part. But because I think these kinds of issues should not be attacked in this way, and I think it does disservice to the great theories of physics and science to treat them in this way, as though they could be carelessly invoked to make a point that is much more properly addressed within the religious tradition of mankind. There's a correlative example I'd like to mention to you. I'll mention it briefly because it's technical. As many of you may know, there's a new theory in physics, new the last 20 years. It's called string theory, and it's, again, one of the theories that proposes to unify everything and form a theory of everything, which will explain exactly how the universe arose and why it's the way it is. It does nothing of the sort. But one of the embarrassing features of the new theory arises when the fine-tuning argument occurs. As again, I'm sure all of you know, the physical constants of the universe seem remarkably well adapted to human life, or animal life for that matter. And no one knows why they have quite the degree of precision that they do. It's an open question. Now, one answer is the one that was put up, several years ago by Fred Hoyle. He said the universe looks like a put-up job. It's a good way of putting it. The universe does look like a put-up job. And one reason that the universe looks like a put-up job, not necessarily the correct reason, but one reason certainly, is that it was put up. Perfectly intelligent sequence of causes and their effects. It looks this way because, well, it is this way. What more do you want in terms of an explanation? Not necessarily the explanation I would accept, but a reasonable explanation. Well, it turns out contemporary theories in particle physics suffer from a mild deficiency They seem to sanction something like 10 to the 500th different landscapes of possibilities. There's nothing like a deficiency in thought to prompt physicists to an inspired leap of the imagination. If there are 10 to the 500th embarrassing universes lying around, couldn't we say that this sort of solves the fine-tuning problem? After all, in some possible universe, the constants are not tuned and life would be pretty crummy. In other universes, they're better tuned than our own, and men would live to 257 years and have 6 wives, all living in perfect contentment and tranquility. A miraculous universe, to be sure, but an enviable one nonetheless. So you have physicists like Leonard Susskind, or again Stephen Hawking, who say, no problem if you're struck in wonder by the fact that the universe seems exceptionally well designed. It's got to be that way. After all, if it wasn't well designed, where would you be? Nowhere, right? But thank goodness there are a lot of possibilities. We just happen to be in a lucky one. A great many intellectuals find this a remarkably satisfying conclusion to reach. Instead of one God, 10 to the 500th different universes. And with the same breath coming bubbling from their torrid lungs, they will tell you, I believe devoutly in Occam's razor. Simplest explanation is the best. Oh, wait a second. This is Richard Dawkins. Wait, Rich. Hold on. 10 to the 500th different universes, and you say that's simpler than one universe and one creator? What are you going to say? Other than give me a break. It's not simpler, it's grotesque. It may be right. I don't know. It may be right. But for heaven's sakes, let us not claim more for a physical theory than we can possibly justify. And at this stage, there is nothing we can justify with respect to those scenarios that makes them in any way superior to the scenarios with which we're familiar and have been familiar for 5,000 years. The scenario encapsulated in the book of Genesis in the beginning, and you know the rest. In the beginning, something happened. That's about what we can say in 2008. It's pretty much what the ancient Hebrews were able to say in the 4th or 5th century BC. Our knowledge is not significantly improved. Why not say so? What harm would come from saying so? Just, that's the way it is. A lot of areas of mystery. One is the origin of the universe. A third point that has exercised my indignation, of course, occurs with respect to Darwin's theory of evolution, a subject that will warm Bruce Chapman's heart, because it is a favorite of all of us at the Discovery Institute, because like some poor dumb beast, it is so obviously easy to flog the thing, and it's such a source of pleasure to keep on flogging it. I never tire of abusing it. It has been the inspiration of my old age, I must tell you. What I think is remarkable in the controversy about Darwin's theory of evolution, two things. First, it's been going on for a long time. And second, it is no closer to resolution than it ever has been. That is to say, those of us who argue against Darwin's theory have failed to elicit, this is just an honest admission of the sort Bruce always encourages me to make, have failed to elicit the wholehearted enthusiasm of the scientific community. And those who advocate Darwin's theory of evolution have failed to persuade the rest of us. The only thing I would say about this situation is that the rest of us seems to include the majority of American citizens, an extremely important fact. Even if the majority of American citizens are totally in the wrong on this issue, I can think of no other example in all of history when an important scientific theory, a dominant position in intellectual life, was held in such contempt and skepticism by the people who are paying for its research. I think it's unprecedented. Can you imagine a similar revolt taking place with respect to any other theory? Say special relativity, which makes very elaborate and contrived claim. The reaction of the American people is good enough for Einstein, it's good enough for me, which I have to tell you is my view too. But Darwin's theory of evolution elicits no measure of comparable respect. People just find that theory impossible to swallow. Just impossible to swallow. Now, having said that there is a measure of continuity in the irresolute nature of the discussion, I want to add one thing which I think is very important, very interesting, and very valuable. I suspect that some of the criticisms that have been made with respect to Darwin's theory of evolution are now being internalized in the biological community itself. I think this is the first time that's happened. First time that's happened. Of course, when they have been internalized, they're inevitably disguised. No one says, I've come to a conversion experience on the road to Damascus. Nobody would dream of saying that. What they inevitably will say is that I have some reservations to make about the master's theory, and they are, in fact, well within the compass of Darwinian principles themselves. All that is obvious nonsense. They're not. For example, it's becoming increasingly clear, let me give you specific examples. It's becoming increasingly clear that when we look at the architecture of the genome on the molecular level, what we see really are roiling waves of probability moving backwards and forwards in no particular direction. This has been clear since the 1960s with the introduction of Komura's very important work on neutral evolution. Recently, a very good geneticist named Michael Lynch has published a book on the architecture of the genome, and he makes this point explicitly, that there is a remarkable disconnect between what we see of the genome and the laws that govern the genome, waves of probability going back and forth, going nowhere in particular, and the magnificent, complex, integrated, hierarchical nature of the human or animal organism itself. We find no way in the literature right now to form a bridge between what we think we see on the molecular level and what we can plainly see in front of our noses. What we see in front of our noses are one another, remarkably complicated structures that we can barely describe, let alone explain. But the recognition that this is so is the first, to my way of thinking, significant objection to Darwinian principles really to have been uttered from within the scientific literature, from within the academy itself. Although, as I say, it's never acknowledged, it's never admitted as such. This view I found affirmed in The Stranger's Quarter by Emil Zuckerkandl, who's a very distinguished American figure in biology, senior figure, ardent in his denunciation of intelligent design, just livid, apoplectic with indignation at the thought that anyone might invoke a creator to explain biological structure. Livid to the point that I'm sure that when he considers the matter, his blood pressure approaches triple digits, as in fact I hope it does. And he writes a long discursive essay on this topic and that topic, and he says, you know, one of the things we don't understand, here, I just mentioned this in passing, it's just a small point, we don't understand how an organism develops from its genome, considering its complexity. That has not properly been addressed. An organism in all its four-dimensional complexity and magnificence and subtlety of structure, we can't quite connect that to the genome. But we will. Now, to say we can't quite connect it is to say 150, 170 years after Darwin wrote, we don't have a clue. We simply don't have a clue. The matter is a total mystery. Why not say so? We don't need answers. We're adults. We're sophisticated. We can live with that degree of uncertainty. The biological community is not going to perish if it says, you know, this is a childish theory. I'm going to give it up. We're going to admit, we're going to face the facts. We're going to deal with the facts as they are, the world as it is, and not the world as we wish it were. What do you think would happen? I'll tell you what would happen, except for funding imbroglios. Nothing bad would happen. For that matter, nothing bad would happen in education if we gave up this attempt so massively to indoctrinate college students who don't want to learn anyway with the fundamentals of Darwinian biology, which only takes a week of class time in any case. I mean, Darwinian biology is not active brain work, right? You know, you sit down with a textbook, they're half pictures, you go on. I mention this because I think these notes of reservation, doubts, and distrust arising from within the scientific community, they really are important. They should be cultivated. They should be nourished. We should pay attention to them because they acknowledge what is so plainly the case, that we really understand these systems very, very poorly. We can describe a black hole in space with far more precision than we can describe a rabbit. That's an astonishing remark. A black hole in space. Nobody's ever seen one of those things. It's a theoretical construction, yet I can write the equations down. I can tell you that's what a black hole is. And if you were to look at it, that's what you would see. I can describe its event horizon, I can describe its radiation, I can describe all of its physical properties. A rabbit? What are you going to tell me about a rabbit except that it hops? Sometimes it eats carrots. It's like the stories evolutionary biologists try to impart about, and this is quoting from the research agenda, why do men like blonde bombshells? Seriously. No, I'm not kidding. No laughter is required. This is an important research question, funded by the National Science Foundation. The research agenda extends over decades of tedious research in strip clubs. So what? Why do men like blonde bombshells? I'll give you two answers. One, they're blonde. Two, they're bombshells. What more you need? And for that matter, the blonde isn't so important. Brunette bombshells do as well. But this is the nature of research in evolutionary psychology. Which brings me to the fourth and mercifully final point I want to make. It's not only evolutionary biology that is a serious issue, or should be a serious issue. Since 1970, with the publication of E.O. Wilson's book on sociobiology, it's been very tempting for biologists and other scientists, philosophers too, God help them, to imagine that the sciences are converging on a unified description of the universe and everything in it. It's a perennial hope of the sciences. There's nothing wrong with a hope. Everyone should have lofty ambitions. The attempt, the last 10, 15 years to include the human mind within the compass of that ambition has been famous and famously known as evolutionary psychology. And that's the fourth of my horsemen, apocalyptic horsemen, because that's a subject. That is a subject which from the bottom of my heart I loathe. Just loathe evolutionary psychology.